Let's talk about something deeply destructive, something that can twist your mind and chain your soul. Hatred. Hatred is an intoxicating emotion, but it's also a corrosive one. It masquerades as strength, but is in reality an admission of weakness. It distorts your perception, hijacks your potential, and in the end, destroys the one who harbors it far more than the one it is directed toward. Hatred doesn't exist in isolation. It needs fuel and it needs targets. And if you look closely, you'll see that a person who hates doesn't just aim their resentment at one person, they attack three primary targets: the person they hate, themselves, and the world. Hatred is a complex and consuming emotion. It does not exist in a vacuum. It demands focus, energy, and time. It is a psychological and emotional investment that often grows beyond the original reason it was formed. A person who harbors hatred fixates on their perceived enemy, crafting narratives around them, analyzing their actions, and attributing malice to their every move. In this way, hatred is a form of obsession, one that has little to do with the target and everything to do with the hater's internal state. When a person hates someone, their mind becomes preoccupied with that individual. They think about them constantly, replaying old interactions, imagining confrontations, and crafting elaborate mental arguments in which they triumph. They scrutinize the person's successes, searching for evidence of their flaws or unworthiness. If that person stumbles, they revel in their failure. If they succeed, they seethe with resentment. In this way, hatred becomes an emotional parasite, feeding off the hater's thoughts, dictating their moods, and shaping their worldview. But here's the crucial point. Hatred rarely destroys its target. Instead, it consumes the person who harbors it. The energy required to sustain deep resentment is immense. It drains the mind, poisons relationships, and diverts attention from meaningful goals. The person who hates becomes reactive rather than proactive, living in response to someone else rather than taking charge of their own life. They no longer act based on their values or aspirations, but instead on their anger and bitterness. They become trapped in a cycle of negativity where every action of their enemy, real or imagined, fuels their internal turmoil. There's also a dangerous illusion that comes with hatred, the idea that by hating someone, a person is somehow exacting justice or balancing the scales. This is a lie. Hatred does not bring justice. It does not undo wrongs, and it does not make the hater stronger. If anything, it makes them weaker. It shifts their focus outward instead of inward, making them more concerned with tearing someone down than building themselves up. They become defined not by their own growth, but by their opposition to another. Consider this: when a person fixates on someone they hate, they are unknowingly elevating that person's importance in their life. They might claim to despise them, yet they give them an extraordinary amount of power. They let this person dictate their emotions, their thoughts, and even their decisions. In essence, they make their enemy the main character in their own life story. And what could be a greater failure than that? Allowing someone you despise to shape your destiny. A person ruled by hatred often engages in self-sabotage. Their focus on their enemy blinds them to their own shortcomings, making self-improvement nearly impossible. Instead of asking, "How can I improve?" they ask, "How can I see them fail?" Instead of seeking excellence, they seek revenge. But revenge, even if achieved, is hollow. It does not erase past wrongs. It only deepens the fixation. This is why some of the most miserable people in the world are those who spend their lives consumed by resentment. They wake up thinking about those they despise. They measure their own success in comparison to others rather than against their own potential. And in doing so, they miss the opportunities that life presents them. While they are busy hating, others are moving forward. While they are brooding over perceived slights, others are learning, growing, and achieving. Hatred is also a thief. It steals time, joy, and peace of mind. It keeps people locked in the past, endlessly replaying old grievances instead of embracing the present or preparing for the future. It fosters a sense of victimhood, making people feel as though they are trapped in a world that has wronged them. But the truth is, the real prison is not external, It is the mindset of hatred itself. To break free, one must recognize the nature of hatred for what it is, an illusion of power that in reality strips power away. Letting go of hatred is not about forgiving or excusing wrongdoing. It is about reclaiming one's mental and emotional energy. It is about refusing to let another person control one's life. It is about choosing to focus on personal growth rather than destruction. The strongest individuals are not those who cling to their grudges, but those who outgrow them. Strength is not found in perpetual resentment, but in the ability to rise above it. It is found in self-discipline, in the pursuit of meaning, and in the commitment to becoming someone so competent and fulfilled that the object of their former hatred becomes irrelevant. Hatred does not stay confined to its external target. It inevitably turns inward. A person who fixates on hating someone else may believe they are directing all their negative energy outward, but the truth is that they are also attacking themselves. This happens in subtle, insidious ways that they may not even realize until the damage has been done. The longer they nurture resentment, the more they corrode their own sense of purpose, self-worth, and mental well-being. Hatred is not merely a burden, it is a poison, and the person who carries it suffers most. When a person dedicates themselves to hating another, they begin defining their existence through opposition rather than aspiration. Instead of focusing on personal goals, self-improvement, and progress, they become trapped in a cycle of comparison and bitterness. They measure their own worth in relation to their enemy, constantly asking, "How do I compare?" or "How can I prove them wrong?" This is a destructive mindset because it shifts the focus away from meaningful self-development. The energy that could be spent on learning, discipline, and personal growth is instead wasted on sustaining anger. The person becomes stuck, unable to move forward because they are too occupied with looking sideways at their perceived rival. This resentment manifests in many ways. Sometimes it breeds self-sabotage. The individual might develop habits that are damaging to their own well-being simply because they are too distracted by their hatred to maintain discipline. They might procrastinate, lose motivation, or avoid challenges because their mind is consumed with thoughts of their enemy rather than their own success. Even worse, they may begin making impulsive, self-destructive decisions driven by the desire to hurt the person they hate, decisions that in the end hurt them far more. Hatred also warps perception. When someone is ruled by resentment, they stop seeing reality clearly. They begin to filter everything through the lens of their negative emotions, interpreting situations in ways that confirm their bitterness. They start to believe that the world is against them, that nothing is fair, and that all success must be undeserved. This leads to a cynical, self-defeating worldview where personal accountability is abandoned. Instead of asking, "What can I do to improve my situation?" they ask, "Why does everything work against me?" This mindset leads to stagnation, as it encourages inaction and blame rather than effort and responsibility. Furthermore, the more a person fixates on their hatred, the more they reinforce a sense of personal inadequacy. After all, if someone truly believed in their own potential, why would they waste time obsessing over another? The very act of dedicating so much emotional energy to resentment is an admission of insecurity. It suggests that deep down the hater feels threatened or inferior, and rather than addressing that feeling directly through discipline, effort, and self-betterment, they externalize it by fixating on another person's downfall. But this does not resolve the insecurity. It amplifies it. Every moment spent in hatred is a moment spent avoiding the real problem, the self. Another tragic consequence of hatred is that it blinds a person to their own faults. When someone is consumed with resentment, they become hyper-aware of every flaw, mistake, or shortcoming in the person they despise. They analyze their enemy's every move, eagerly searching for proof of their failure or hypocrisy. But this obsessive scrutiny is rarely turned inward. The hater does not subject themselves to the same level of analysis or accountability. They do not examine their own weaknesses with the same intensity that they examine others. This lack of self-awareness leads to stagnation, as true personal growth requires humility, the ability to recognize and address one's own shortcomings. This also creates a dangerous contradiction. The more a person hates, the more they become like the thing they despise. Hatred fosters arrogance, bitterness, and a lack of introspection, all qualities that they may claim to hate in others. In their quest to prove themselves superior to their enemy, they end up embodying the very traits they claim to reject. They become resentful, petty, and reactive, mirroring the worst aspects of the person they despise. In this way, hatred does not just harm them, it transforms them into something they never intended to be. This is where faith enters the picture. Faith is the opposite of control. It is the act of surrendering to something beyond oneself, acknowledging that one is not the center of the universe, and recognizing that true security does not come from self-aggrandizement, but from trust in a higher power. For the narcissist, this is an incredibly difficult concept to accept. To surrender control feels like annihilation. To admit they are dependent on something greater than themselves feels like failure, but in reality, it is the only path to true strength. When a person lives without faith, they are left to rely solely on their own abilities, their own intellect, their own capacity for manipulation and control. But human ability is limited, and no matter how powerful a person may seem, there will always come a moment when their strength is not enough. They will encounter suffering they cannot avoid, loss they cannot replace, and emptiness they cannot fill. The narcissist, who has spent their life believing that self-sufficiency is the highest virtue, finds themselves utterly unprepared when faced with a reality they cannot control. Faith, in contrast, teaches a person to accept that they are not meant to bear the weight of existence alone. It provides a framework for understanding suffering, failure, and imperfection, not as things to be feared and avoided at all costs, but as necessary parts of the journey toward wisdom and transformation. The narcissist believes that admitting weakness is dangerous, that to show vulnerability is to invite destruction, but faith reveals that only through vulnerability can true strength emerge. Christ himself exemplified this paradox. He did not seek power through domination or validation. He did not build a persona to impress others. He did not avoid suffering or weakness. Instead, he willingly embraced it, demonstrating that the highest form of strength is found in surrender to God's. The narcissist who has spent their life running from their own brokenness must confront this truth. Their healing will not come through more self-exaltation, but through humility, through surrender, through faith in something beyond themselves. But faith is not just about surrender, it is also about transformation. When a person places their trust in God, they do not simply let go of control, they begin to be reshaped. Their desires change, their perception of others shifts. The narcissist who once saw people as tools for validation begins to see them as fellow souls, equally valuable, equally flawed, equally in need of grace. This shift is profound because narcissism is fundamentally self-centered, while faith is fundamentally other-centered. The narcissist, if they truly embrace faith, will find that their relationships begin to change. Not because they have learned new techniques for manipulation, but because they have genuinely come to see others through the lens of love rather than exploitation. There is a reason why so many biblical teachings emphasize the death of the self that seeks constant validation, the self that builds itself up through pride, the self that refuses to acknowledge its own brokenness. This self must die for something greater to emerge. Whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Matthew 10:39. This is one of the most challenging teachings for the narcissist to accept, but it is also the most liberating. To lose one's false self is not to disappear, it is to finally become real. The narcissist fears losing themselves, but in truth, they have never truly known themselves. They have spent their lives constructing a persona to hide their true nature. Faith calls them to step out of that illusion and into the light, to see themselves as they really are, not as they wish to be seen. This is painful. It requires brutal honesty. It requires them to let go of the carefully curated image they have built and admit that they are not superior, not invincible, not above the need for grace. But with this honesty comes freedom, because once they let go of their obsession with being seen as great, they can finally begin to experience true greatness, the greatness of humility, of love, of service to something beyond themselves. Instead of using people to feed their ego, they can learn to genuinely care for others. Instead of fearing exposure, they can embrace authenticity. Instead of chasing admiration, they can seek meaning. Faith offers the narcissist a new way of being, one that is not built on illusion but on truth. It does not simply tell them to be different, it empowers them to become different. It gives them the strength to confront their own emptiness, the courage to let go of their false self, and the assurance that they are already valuable, not because of what they achieve, but because they are loved by God. This transformation does not happen overnight. It is a process, often painful, often met with resistance, but it is the only real path to healing. Without faith, the narcissist will continue the endless cycle of seeking validation and never feeling fulfilled. With faith, they can step off that exhausting treadmill and into a new reality, one where they no longer have to prove themselves because they have already been chosen. Faith is not just a set of beliefs, it is an invitation to let go of control, to embrace humility, to trust that true worth is found not in the self, but in something far greater. The narcissist who accepts this invitation will find that what they feared most, the loss of their carefully crafted identity, is actually their greatest liberation. Because in losing their false self, they finally discover who they were meant to be. Humility is often seen as weakness in the eyes of the narcissist. It is a concept they resist because their entire psychological framework is built upon the illusion of superiority. To acknowledge the need for humility is to admit that they are not above others, that they are not exempt from flaws, and that their identity is not defined by their ability to control how others perceive them. But this is precisely why humility is the antidote to narcissism. It dismantles the false self, allowing the individual to confront their true nature and, in doing so, find healing. Narcissism thrives on a carefully constructed delusion. The narcissist projects an image of perfection, dominance, or brilliance because they fear that, without this mask, they will be exposed as inadequate. This fear is often rooted in childhood experiences where they either felt insignificant or were conditioned to believe that their worth depended on their ability to impress others. Over time, this external validation became their primary source of identity. The idea of being ordinary, of being just another flawed human being, is intolerable because it threatens the very foundation of their self-worth. But this is a self-imposed prison. To live in constant fear of being unmasked is to live in chains. The narcissist must always be performing, always maintaining the illusion, always ensuring that they are perceived as powerful or exceptional. This is an exhausting way to live, and deep down they know it. The constant need for validation is never fully satisfied. No amount of praise is ever enough. No accomplishment, no status, no admiration can permanently silence the inner voice that whispers, "What if they see the real you?" Humility, then, is not a punishment, it is liberation. It is the key that unlocks the door to authenticity. To be humble is not to think less of oneself, but to see oneself accurately. It is to recognize that, like every other human being, one is a mixture of strengths and weaknesses, greatness and frailty, wisdom and foolishness. It is the acceptance of reality as it is, rather than the constant attempt to manipulate reality into something that serves one's ego. Hatred is a a fundamentally isolating force. It creates an emotional wall between the person who harbors it and the world around them. Even if they are surrounded by friends or family, their focus is constantly being pulled toward their enemy, leaving less space for meaningful relationships. Their thoughts are dominated by bitterness, by grudges, by imaginary confrontations that replay over and over in their minds. They become unable to fully engage in the present because their mind is stuck in a cycle of resentment. As a result, even in moments of happiness, there is an underlying tension, a mental weight that prevents them from feeling truly at ease. This negativity does not go unnoticed. Even if a person believes they are hiding their hatred well, it reveals itself in subtle ways. It can be seen in the way they speak, how often they complain, how quickly they turn conversations toward grievances, how easily they interpret things in the most negative light. It can be seen in their body language, tightness in their posture, moments of irritation, a general air of frustration. The people around them may not always know exactly what is wrong, but they can feel it. Over time, this begins to push people away. Relationships, whether friendships, family bonds, or romantic connections, require emotional openness. They require trust, vulnerability, and a willingness to see the best in others. But a person consumed by hatred struggles to offer these things. The very nature of resentment breeds suspicion. If they assume the worst in one person, it becomes easier to assume the worst in others. If they are constantly focused on past wrongs, they become hyper-aware of potential betrayals, always looking for reasons to distrust, always questioning the motives of those around them. This creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. By expecting disloyalty, they become guarded, cold, and distant, pushing others away until eventually their fears of isolation become reality. Hatred also distorts priorities. The energy spent on resentment is energy that could have been invested in relationships, in career growth, in learning, and self-improvement. But when hatred becomes a dominant force in a person's life, it diverts attention away from these meaningful pursuits. Conversations become less about sharing ideas and more about venting frustrations. Social interactions become opportunities to reaffirm grievances rather than opportunities for genuine connection. Over time, people grow tired of the negativity. They begin to distance themselves, either consciously or unconsciously, because being around someone consumed by hatred is exhausting. This is one of the greatest tragedies of sustained resentment. It isolates the person who carries it. They often do not realize it is happening. They may convince themselves that others are withdrawing because they are disloyal or because they don't understand. But in reality, people are distancing themselves because they can sense the weight of the negativity. No one enjoys being around someone who is constantly bitter, who is always looking for reasons to be angry, who sees the world through a lens of hostility. This kind of emotional isolation leads to an even greater sense of injustice. The person who harbors hatred begins to feel misunderstood, abandoned, even victimized by those around them. They see their growing loneliness as proof that the world is against them rather than as a consequence of their own behavior. This fuels their resentment further, creating a downward spiral in which their hatred drives people away and their isolation deepens their hatred. The longer this cycle continues, the harder it becomes to break free from it. Hatred can become a core part of a person's identity. They start to define themselves by their grudges, by their opposition to their enemy, by their sense of moral outrage. And when that identity is challenged, when someone suggests that they should let go of their resentment, they resist, because to let go of hatred would mean to acknowledge that they have spent years, perhaps even decades, fixated on something that ultimately brought them nothing but pain. That is a hard truth to face. But it is also a necessary one. A person cannot live a fulfilling life while carrying deep hatred. They may convince themselves that their resentment gives them strength, that it fuels them, that it is justified, but in reality, it is only robbing them of joy, of connection, of the ability to move forward. True strength is not found in holding on to grudges. It is found in the ability to rise above them. Breaking free from this cycle requires an active choice. It requires a person to shift their focus away from resentment and toward something greater. Instead of obsessing over their enemy, they must invest in their own development. Instead of fixating on past wrongs, they must look toward future possibilities. Instead of allowing hatred to isolate them, they must seek relationships built on trust, openness, and shared purpose. This is not easy. It requires humility, the willingness to admit that one's resentment has caused harm. It requires discipline, the ability to redirect energy away from negativity and toward growth. And it requires courage, the strength to let go of an identity built on hatred and to build something new. But the alternative is far worse. A life consumed by resentment is a life half lived. It is a life spent in mental chains, unable to experience real freedom, real connection, real meaning. It is a path that leads only to loneliness, to bitterness, to regret. The choice is clear. A person can continue to let hatred control them, watching as it pushes people away, poisons relationships, and isolates them from the world, or they can choose to break free, to reclaim their time, their energy, and their ability to build something meaningful. Because at the end of the day, hatred is not a weapon against an enemy. It is a weight that holds the hater down. And the sooner one realizes that, the sooner they can begin the process of letting it go. Hatred has a way of eroding the very essence of who a person is. It does not simply exist as an emotion. It embeds itself into the fabric of a person's thoughts, behaviors, and even their identity. When someone fixates on their hatred toward another, they may believe they are directing their energy outward toward their enemy, toward proving a point, toward seeking some form of justice or revenge. But in reality, they are allowing that hatred to dictate their choices, their values, and ultimately the trajectory of their life. The irony is profound. The more a person dedicates themselves to despising someone else, the more control that person has over them. They become enslaved to their resentment, unable to think or act independently of it. The most dangerous aspect of hatred is that it distorts priorities. A person who is consumed by resentment no longer makes decisions based on what is best for them, what aligns with their personal growth, or what will lead to a better future. Instead, they begin making choices based on their hatred. They ask themselves, how can I prove them wrong, rather than how can I improve myself? They prioritize revenge over progress, bitterness over opportunity, and conflict over resolution. This leads them down a path where their actions are reactive rather than intentional. They stop thinking in terms of their own goals and start defining their life in relation to their enemy. This shift in priorities often manifests in ways that are self-destructive. A person ruled by hatred may abandon opportunities simply because they do not want their enemy to see them succeed in a way that does not involve confrontation. They may waste time arguing, obsessing, and proving themselves rather than working towards something meaningful. Every moment spent stewing in resentment is a moment not spent building, creating, or achieving. And yet, because hatred feels powerful, because it gives a false sense of purpose, it can be incredibly difficult to recognize just how much it is draining from one's life. Hatred also breeds an unhealthy attachment to the past. A person trapped in resentment cannot move forward because they are too preoccupied with looking back. They replay old arguments, relive past betrayals, and reanalyze moments that no longer matter except in their own mind. This mental fixation prevents growth. It keeps them emotionally anchored to a version of themselves that should have evolved. And worse, it prevents them from seeing new opportunities, new relationships, and new experiences with clarity. This attachment to the past creates another problem. It prevents a person from developing a strong sense of self. When someone defines themselves through their opposition to another, they are not truly defining themselves at all. They are allowing someone else, someone they claim to despise, to dictate their values, their emotions, and their actions. True self-definition requires independence. It requires standing for something, not just standing against something. A person who spends their life in opposition never builds anything of their own. They only react. This lack of self-identity is one of the most tragic consequences of prolonged hatred. A person may believe they are fighting against something external, but in reality, they are losing themselves in the process. They become someone who is fueled by anger rather than ambition, by grievance rather than vision. Over time, they begin to embody the very qualities they claim to despise: intolerance, bitterness, and an inability to move on. They may look at their enemy with contempt, believing them to be small-minded, vindictive, or petty, but in their own relentless focus on hatred, they become those things themselves.
Even more insidious is the way hatred can strip away a person's ability to experience joy. When someone is consumed by resentment, they become incapable of truly enjoying success, love, or even simple pleasures. Every moment of happiness is either overshadowed by lingering bitterness or dismissed as temporary, insignificant in the grand scheme of their ongoing war against their enemy. This means that even if they achieve something great, they cannot fully appreciate it. Their hatred keeps them focused on what is missing, what is unfair, or what they still have to prove. In this way, hatred robs them not only of the future, but also of the present. The worst part is that hatred offers nothing in return. Unlike discipline, which leads to achievement, or perseverance, which leads to progress, hatred is an investment that yields no positive return. It does not build anything, strengthen anything, or create anything of value. It is purely destructive, destroying relationships, opportunities, peace of mind, and ultimately the person who harbors it. A life centered around hatred is a life of exhaustion, because hatred requires constant maintenance. It must be fed with new grievances, new arguments, and new justifications. A person who lives in hatred must always be looking for reasons to stay angry, because the moment they stop, they are forced to confront the emptiness it has left behind. Breaking free from hatred requires a fundamental shift in thinking. It demands that a person stop defining themselves through opposition and start defining themselves through purpose. Instead of asking, "How can I hurt them?" they must ask, "How can I better myself?" Instead of dwelling on past wrongs, they must focus on future possibilities. Instead of allowing resentment to control their actions, they must take deliberate steps toward independence, self-growth, and meaning. This is not an easy process. Hatred is addictive, and letting it go can feel like surrender. But in truth, letting go is not weakness. It is the ultimate act of strength. The people who truly succeed in life are not those who hold on to their resentments the longest. They are the ones who outgrow them. They are the ones who recognize that hatred is a burden that serves no purpose, and that the only way forward is to set it down. They refuse to let the existence of an enemy define their path. They understand that the best revenge is not destruction, but self-transformation. A person has a choice. They can continue to let hatred shape their identity, consume their thoughts and dictate their actions, or they can reclaim their own life, focusing on building something meaningful rather than tearing something down. They can choose to define themselves not by their grievances, but by their aspirations. And when they make that choice, when they refuse to be ruled by resentment, they find something far more valuable than revenge. They find freedom. Hatred is a deceptive force. It convinces a person that they are fighting against an enemy, when in reality they are waging war against themselves. It consumes time, energy, and identity, distorting priorities, poisoning relationships, and robbing life of meaning. The more a person fixates on their resentment, the more power they give to the very thing they despise. Hatred isolates, blinds, and ultimately enslaves, turning its carrier into a prisoner of their own bitterness. But there is an alternative. A person can choose to break free, to reject the cycle of resentment, and to reclaim their own life. This does not mean forgetting injustice or pretending that pain does not exist. It means refusing to let that pain define the future. True strength is not found in clinging to hatred, but in overcoming it. It is found in shifting focus from destruction to creation, from vengeance to progress, from resentment to responsibility. The path forward is clear. Let go of the weight that holds you down. Do not allow your enemies to dictate the course of your life. Instead, channel your energy into becoming something greater, something stronger, something independent of the past. Because the moment you release hatred, you step into the freedom of your own potential. And in that moment, you no longer just survive. You rise.